Welcome to Reading Rural, y'all, where we talk about all things rural YA literature and to the rural authors who write it. I'm your host, Dr. Shay Parton, and I'm excited to talk to you about today's topic at hand. If you're a teacher, student, or community member in a rural community, my hope is that the content here honors you and your experiences by discussing and analyzing books that can serve as a mirror for you. If you're an urban or suburban teacher, student, or community member, this series is for you too, and I hope that it can provide nuance to the stereotypical depictions of rural people so often seen in popular media. So come on in, and let's get to it. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Reading Rural, y'all. I am your host, Dr. Shay Parton, and I am so excited to be talking with the author of one of the best books I've read this year, Ginny Myers Sain. Ginny is the author of the Whippoorwill Award-winning book Dark and Shallow Lies and has recently released Secrets So Deep. She's a theater lover and teacher and brings that knowledge to the worlds and characters she builds in her novels. She currently lives in Tulsa, Oklahoma with her teenage son. When she's not working in the theater or writing, you're likely to find her listening to true crime podcasts, taking pictures of alligators, eating tacos, traveling to spooky places, or planning a trip to Walt Disney World. So welcome, Ginny. Thanks so much for being here.
Oh, you're so welcome. I'm really excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so we're going to jump in, and I'm excited to learn more about this. It's my obsession and my favorite question out of every interview that I ask, and it is, where are you from, and how do you feel like that impacts who you are as a person and as a writer?
Sure, yeah. I was born in Oklahoma. I grew up in Oklahoma in a small town called Chandler, which is about halfway between Oklahoma City and Tulsa, which are the only two places in Oklahoma that anybody else has probably heard of. So Chandler's about halfway in between those, which means it's about an hour and a half from anywhere. And it's a small town. There were 70-something people in my graduating class from high school, so it's a real little town. I grew up there, went to high school there, and then when I went to college, I moved from that small town to another small town. I went to college in a small town in Arkansas, Clarksville, which is a town of about 7,000 people, a college of at that time, about 500 students. So it was a really little campus in a really little town. So, and then lived and worked in Clarksville after I graduated from college on that campus for the next 20 years or so. So I've spent almost all of my life in really little rural towns. I currently live in Tulsa. I've lived here for about 8 years, but this is my first time living in the big city. Up until then, it's been small towns all the way. So I think, it impacted my life in a lot of ways. I did not realize until I kind of moved to Tulsa, sort of the fundamental differences that I would notice. There's such a feeling of community in a small town, and that can be good and that can be bad. Everybody knows your business, and sometimes that's great. Sometimes it's not so great, and I think those of us that move from little towns to big cities or bigger cities like Tulsa, we tend to kind of recreate that small town community feel in the city. We find our people and we sort of make our little communities. As far as writing, it's definitely impacted everything that I've written so far has been set in a smaller rural community. Not always quite as rural as the one in Dark and Shallow Lies that's, accessible only by boat and has a population of, like 100 people. So they're not all quite that rural, but they're definitely all rural. And that's because, I don't know if I could write a city set book. I don't know those places like I know small towns. And I don't mean like I don't know where stuff is. I mean like I don't know like what's at the heart of those communities, and there is something definitely, it's just a different something. But those aren't the voices that I hear in my head, and those aren't the stories that I feel in my bones. So those are not the stories that I tend to tell.
Yeah, so we didn't really talk about this before we got on here, but just to sort of like let you know a little bit about me, I guess, so that the rest of this conversation might take on a different a different life, I guess. I graduated with 50 people. I'm from a town of 800 people, just outside of Muncie, where Ball State University is. And then when I left to go to school, I went to Purdue University, which is a land grant university and ag-based, but it's huge. And in the dorm that I lived in, housed the same number of people that lived in my town.
Right.
And so so that had a profound effect on it was so hard for me. It was so hard for me there. I thought about dropping out a lot, but my mom wouldn't hear of it. And so, it was so uncomfortable to be there because it was hard to find other rural people. There's no rural cultural center on a college campus,
Right.
Unless you go to the ag building, and so like, I just, I had a hard time there. And then, I taught in a rural school and thought that I would feel at home there. It wasn't the rural school that I went to, but having been out, having out migrated for a little while and then coming back in, like I was different and I couldn't figure out like why, like, like what was wrong, like why I didn't just like, here I am and this is me. And, I had a hard time understanding like why I didn't fit in the way that I thought I was going to there. And then when I came to Austin, to do my PhD, it was like a culture shock. Like you're telling me I have to pay to park here, like, you're telling me I can't just park in this garage anytime. Like there are hours and, like I avoided so many like outings and stuff because I had no idea how to navigate the place of the city. And I remember having a conversation with a couple of friends, one who moved from Seattle, and she was like, guys, I'm having such a hard time here. The city is so quiet. And I was like, excuse me.
Yeah, it's all on what you're used to, right? I mean, and I love cities. Like I love New York. I spend a lot of time in New York. My best friend lives in New York. And I get up there as often as I can. I love New Orleans. I love cities. But I don't know that I just don't know that I'd ever be able to write one with that, the honesty that I want to be able to find.
Yeah. And the authenticity, right? Because it's like, I don't know, like it's hard to capture. I think it's hard to capture, like you were saying before, the core of it, the heart of it, like what is it that makes this place and these people that's hard to know.
And there are so many already. There's so many good New York stories from people that really get New York, and there's so many good San Francisco stories from people that really get San Francisco or those places. And I don't think there are as many rural stories, so maybe that's not a bad thing, that's where we're sticking.
Yeah, no, I'm grateful that you're writing rural stories. That's my whole shtick, like
right.
More people need to write them and more people need to read them, and so this conversation is really interesting to me in terms of thinking about the setting of Dark and Shallow Lies. We talked a little bit about this before I started recording, but you don't see a lot of Cajun representation in literature or TV or film. And if you do, it's usually something negative. Acadian language and all of that is really associated. It's kind of like the Louisiana redneck, that sort of. And so I was just curious, like, you talked a little bit just a minute ago about being in New Orleans, but in terms of like capturing, because I really feel like there's a distinct identity and a very I don't know, fleshed out, like it feels like a real place, the setting of Dark and Shallow Lies. And so I was just curious about like your research process, like what was that like? Have you ever lived in a place like that? Like how do you
like I said, I grew up in Oklahoma and then lived a huge chunk of my life in Arkansas. So I'm not from Louisiana. I have spent a lot of time in Louisiana. I've got a cousin that lives down there in New Orleans now. We get down there pretty often. I love that city, spend a lot of time down there. My first introduction to Louisiana was as a college student. I had a boyfriend my freshman year. And then for all of college, for all 4 years of college, I had a boyfriend who grew up. He was from Lake Charles, Louisiana. And we used to go down there all the time. And that was kind of my first introduction to that culture and those people. And I just fell so in love with that part of the country, in love with particularly, the Cajun people and the culture and the dialect and the food and the music. I mean, there's just so much to love there. But mostly the people who just, were so welcoming and so gracious and so much fun. And for a girl from Oklahoma, it was like, I might as well have gone to Mars. I mean, it was that recognizable rural experience, but it was such a different variety of it. It was such a different color and shade of it. And there were alligators, and there was all this food that I'd never heard of, and there was this music that I just loved that I'd never heard before. And I fell so in love with that, and that even after things did not work out with the boy, and that love affair with Louisiana sort of continued on. And I've since gone on to spend a great deal of time down in that part of the country. So, one of the things I wanted to do when I wrote that book was reflect the incredible diversity that is in that area. There's people tend to think of cities as being these very diverse places and rural areas as being very sort of, like not diverse, right? And particularly in that part of Louisiana, there's so many cultures, and there's so much history, and there's so much beautiful, so many beautiful stories from so many different kinds of people, and that I really wanted to reflect that in the story that I was telling. But I also wanted to be sensitive that those were not necessarily my stories to tell. So my character, the main character in Dark and Shallow Lies, is not of Cajun descent. She doesn't have that background, but she comes into that culture very much and experiences those people sort of as someone who's come in from the outside, very much like I did when I went down there. So that's kind of where that part of the story came from. It's actually based on two small towns. There's a small town in Florida called Cassadaga that calls itself the psychic capital of the world. And we just stumbled across it on a road trip across Florida. It's like this tiny little town, like I think there are like 500 people that live there. It's this little bitty place, but it's full of psychics and rock shops and crystals and tarot card readers. And I was standing there and I just thought, whoa, this would make the coolest setting for a book. Except it's right on the interstate, you zip on and zip off. And I thought, well, I need someplace farther away, harder to get to. So that's how I ended up way down in the bayou.
Yeah. I was curious too about it's La Cachette, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I don't know if you know Rob Costello or not, but we recently did a presentation on YA, like horror stories or like dark fantasy, those kind of things, and thinking about the rural, because while rural is underrepresented in like, realistic fiction, it is sort of overrepresented in horror
right.
and speculative fiction for a lot of different reasons.
Yeah.
More toward like the deliverance side of things.
Yeah.
That, are a little more affirming and not so deficit. But I was curious because of the way that La Cachette is positioned as this very isolated. So not only is it rural, but it's also remote. And I think that is really important. That doesn't often get acknowledged either. And so I was wondering, like, as you were building the world and as you were building the story, like what kinds of things along those lines were you thinking about that needed to be true for this place in order to be able to tell the story that you wanted to tell?
Yeah. It definitely is remote, and I mentioned that all of the stories, including Secret So Deep, which comes out in September, and then the projects that I'm working on now, they're all rural set, but definitely La Cachette is the only one that is truly remote, cut off from the rest of the world like that. And I think that's probably why we see a lot of horror set in sort of rural areas, is it does have that sort of cut off, remote, feeling. If you think about like The Shining, set at that hotel that you can't get to or you can't get away from. I mean, there's that feeling of sort of isolation. I mentioned that La Cachette is based on two towns, the first one being Cassadaga in Florida, the psychic capital of the world. The other one is a town that was a real town. It was called Pilotstown, Louisiana. And Pilotstown, Louisiana was a place on the river down at the very mouth of the Mississippi, right before you hit the Gulf of Mexico. That was basically a home for the riverboat pilots and their families. That's who lived there. That's the only people that lived there. Because if you're going to navigate, at the time, if you're going to navigate your big container ship or your cargo ship up the Mississippi to port in New Orleans, you had to take on a riverboat pilot. Like, not just anybody could do that. You really had to know the river. That town, unfortunately, sort of dwindled away over the years. And then Hurricane Katrina kind of finished it off. It's not there anymore. But before that happened, I was on a cruise down the Mississippi one day, kind of at one of those like excursion, day trips from New Orleans. And I saw saw what was left of it. Our guide had pointed it out and sort of told us a little bit about the history, and that place sort of lodged itself in my brain, so that it came back out when I was looking for that more remote setting. So, part of it was that there was a real place I was sort of basing it on, and I did a lot of research into Pilot Town and how it was built there on the boardwalk and the geographical location of it, and how the storms affected it, and how people got there and got away from there, and what life was like there. So that was helpful, that there was a little bit of a basis. Of course, they weren't psychic, there were some other differences. But research is something that I really enjoy as a writer. And I think a lot of, most of us really love that part of it, partly because it keeps us from actually having to write, as long as we can say that we're researching, like we're working, but we're not actually having to write anything yet. So I enjoyed that part of it. I did a lot of research into it. We actually did bring on, in the final stages of revision, we brought on an authenticity reader who was someone from New Orleans who was very immersed in Cajun culture and Louisiana history, everything from like the flora and fauna of the bayous, to every historical thing, and who went over that manuscript with a fine tooth comb. And, one of the things that I was proudest of was that he found very, very little, that he said, this is not accurate, or we need to change. There were only like one or two little things. And that's because I loved that research process so much and just really got into it.
I think, yeah. And I think a lot of people, who aren't writers don't really think about how that happens or what that looks like, and how important that is to the process, especially when it comes to like place and
specifically there was one point where I mentioned this specific flower that she was looking at in the bayou, way back in there, and how it only blooms, in the summer, and the way it smells. And the authenticity reader was like, yes, that's true. This flower only blooms, so it was great to have that firm. But he said, but it's been raining a lot here in this story, and this particular flower would not bloom under those conditions. It was something like very, very, very specific like that. So yeah, I mean, those manuscripts by the writer, and then by your copy editor, and then by your authenticity reader, if you bring one on board, or whoever, they get gone over with like a fine-tooth comb for sure.
Yeah. And even just like, I think maybe sometimes we don't even realize like how important it is to the story, which is why I like to ask about it, because as much as we dismiss place in terms of like how it defines us as people, and how like the people in a place define that place, and how that reciprocal relationship happens, like we do that in real life.
Yeah.
And then when it comes to novels, I think that we overlook it even more, but I think it's so powerful and so important. And so thank you for talking a little bit about that.
Oh yeah, you're welcome. One of my favorite things is when somebody from Louisiana says, I loved this book. I'm from Louisiana. It felt like home to me, it rang true. Like that's the highest compliment that I get about that particular story, and that's what I wanted. I didn't want there to be anything that would pull somebody out, even if it's just one or two readers, to be like, that's not how we say that, or that's not what we, that's not accurate. So that's always a nice thing to hear.
Yeah, it was super immersive, and I felt like I was there. I felt like I was in there. I felt like I was there when I left, like it's something that I think that Dark and Televised is a book that, stays with you. It's one of those that you don't really want to let go of, because you are still sort of with the characters, and you're still, I think that it lingers. And those are my favorite because awesome. They inspire further thinking and questioning, and
oh yeah, I've gotten a lot of messages, emails, and messages on like Instagram and Twitter from people who are like, now I'm really desperate to go to Louisiana. I want to see, I want to see the bayou. I want to get down to New Orleans. I'm like, that's great. That's awesome. I love that.
Yeah, especially thinking about like growing up in a rural place, and how books really function as travel. Especially if
absolutely, yeah,
you're sort of in a class position that I grew up in, where
right, yeah,
very often,
yeah, me too, definitely.
So I think that's really great. So you talk a little bit about your connection to theater, and how important that is to you, and how it's like your first love in the bio on your website. And so I was wondering if you would talk a little bit about like how that turned into novel writing for you, like why you became a writer, why writing is important to you, those kind of things.
Yeah, absolutely. I never really was a writer. I always knew that I was good at writing, and I enjoyed it. I did a lot of writing in high school. We have an arts institute here in Oklahoma for high school students called Quartz Mountain that you apply to and, get accepted to. And I went in writing. I won a lot of, those awards that you win in high school for writing. And I wrote in college. I knew I was a good writer and I enjoyed writing, but it was always theater that really was my thing from the time I was very, very little. And I always loved, everything about theater. I love directing. I love acting. I love all of it. And the reason that I became a writer is pretty simple. I wanted to make some more money, and I did not want to get a real job. So those are two things that I did not want to do. I did not want to like go get a job where I was like working from 9 to 5 every day. And because you work in a theater, you get used to a certain amount of like flexibility, right? I at the time was running my own theater company, and we were doing classes and workshops and things mostly with kids and high school students and elementary students, junior high kids, and that was just really taking off, and we were doing really well. It had actually just like hired some extra people to teach for us, and then COVID happened and all of that kind of ground to a halt. So at that particular point, I'd been kind of messing around, with this idea for a book for a while. It was kind of in my head, and, kind of like the rest of the world, when COVID happened, we had to like find something to do. And I am not a bread baker, and I'm not like a cross stitcher or an embroiderer or anything. So I finished the book. And that's what happened. I come from a family of writers. My mom is a writer. She has like 19 middle grade novels, all, award-winning, mostly historical fiction. Her name is Anna Myers. So I grew up with writers. I grew up around writers. There were always writers in our house. I always knew it was a real job that people could do. She put us through college with those books. So I knew that was a thing that could happen. My dad was a poet. My brother, Ben Myers, is a poet. He was the poet laureate for the state of Oklahoma a couple of years ago. So that's what I usually tell when people ask that question, why did you decide to become a writer? It's because my little brother became the poet laureate of our state. And I really could not let that stand. I had to do something to try to keep up.
That's awesome. That's so great too, that you had all of that experience, because, I always believed that growing up anyway, and I would say probably a fair amount into adulthood, I believe that writers only came from places like LA and Chicago and New York, and that because I was, this rural simpleton, like nobody really cared cared about my experiences. They didn't care about what I had to say. And so and I think a lot of that, was allowed to stay because we didn't read books like ones that you're writing. I didn't. When we read rural stories, they were canonical, where the rural is pathologized and it's something to be cured and fixed. And,
right.
And so, there were no stories like Dark and Shallow Lies, at least not ones that I was encouraged to read. And then I passed that on to my students, where I also didn't include any rural stories in my classroom. And so now I'm trying to kind of undo that by talking with rural people who have become writers and who are telling really important rural stories. And so I'm so glad that you had those experiences that encouraged you to do this thing, to write these rural stories, because they're hard to find.
They are, and particularly growing up in Oklahoma, I think Oklahoma is of course a largely rural state, and most people who live in Oklahoma live in rural areas. If you don't live in one of our, two major cities, that's pretty much where you are. But we've always also been a state that does have kind of a rich history as far as literature goes and music goes, and even that sort of thing, so I always knew, we even have our own Broadway musical. It was not written by anyone who had ever been to Oklahoma, but we have one and our name's in it. So I always knew, I grew up surrounded by arts people, whether they were my mom and dad's writer friends or my theater, people at school. I always felt that artistic community in that small rural town, which was a real gift growing up, for sure.
Yeah, that's super, it's just excellent. I just, I think about like, John Mellencamp and, like Indiana's sort of like artists claim to fame. Like there are so few
Yeah. Yeah.
um that it was just like, it just seemed impossible or improbable. And when you come from a working class family, like you're supposed to get something that's going to be lucrative, like
Right.
you're not supposed to want to do something that you may not make any money at all.
Right, right. Yeah.
Um,
My mother was a teacher and my father was a poet. So yeah, I know what you mean.
like Shay, you probably should do something, probably
So
be
I
a
chose
doctor,
theater, obviously.
be a doctor. And so like just all of these things that come from family and class position and place,
Sure. Yeah. There's a lot, it's a
totally
lot tied into
affect.
it. Yeah.
Yeah. So thinking about you as a writer and sort of the stories that you've written, how do you go about it? Like I think about my students and teaching them the writing process and what that can look like for them, because everyone's process is different. And so I'm just curious if you'd be willing to share, in case teachers want to share with their students, like what.
Absolutely. Yeah. Um, if there are kids out there, particularly that want to write, or teachers that want to encourage their kids to write, there are all kinds, of course, of writing exercises and writing things you can do. But the most important thing you can do is read. You learn to be a writer by being a reader. And I think of so much, good literature that I read and internalized as a kid. And I don't necessarily mean just classics, because, classics are great to read, but there's so much good contemporary literature, and there's so much good, we get so hung up, I think, on what good literature is, and there's so much variety out there, and there's so much different stuff you can read. But the more you read, that is good quality writing, the better writer you become. So that's how I became a writer. I was a kid that loved to read, and by the time I sat down and was ready to write, really, in high school, that just kind of was there, that well of knowledge to draw on, and that idea of how sentences work and how descriptions work and how characters are put together. And the other thing specifically that I tell writers a lot is, if you want to learn how to write dialogue in particular, which is a really tricky thing for some writers, is to read plays. Plays are the best way to learn how to write dialogue. If you're writing a play and you're a playwright, dialogue is literally all you have. You don't get that internal monologue or the character's thought process or the description. I mean, if you can't get the idea across in dialogue, it's not going to happen, right? And so that's a great way to learn dialogue. Also, you have to really economize when you're writing a play as far as dialogue. Your character cannot ramble on for 5 or 6 pages. You're going to lose your audience that way. So I really, really recommend, if you want to write dialogue well, read plays. Other than that, the only way to do it is just to sit down and practice and practice and practice and practice, for sure.
So I have a couple of questions. One builds on something that you just said. Monica Rowe and I were talking about like rural language variety, and like how I had a question about how do you capture like language variety and dialect? How do you make choices about what that looks like?
Right. That was a really tricky thing. And particularly if you're talking about Cajun dialect, because when I first went down to that area, I was so in love with just the sound of the language down there, the sound of it and the layers of it, the different cultural influences. But it's such a beautiful spoken dialect, that I really wanted to capture that in a way that would convey not only, the uniqueness and the specialness of that place, but also just the beauty of it, and the sort of the magic of it. And I think the trick for writing any kind of dialect like that is to do it very, very sparingly. So I picked 3 or 4 words that I wrote in dialect, and that was it. Because I wanted, and those were the words that to me felt like you had to be written that way. Because you don't want to overwhelm your reader. You don't want to make it hard to read. You don't want to make it, complicated, or heavy-handed. So that's what I do. I think that stylistically, I've seen a lot of other writers sort of make that same choice. And it's the one that worked best for me as a reader. So it's the one that I went with as a writer, was just to pick out, a couple of things. And once the reader sort of gets into that and finds that rhythm, then they sort of do the rest of it themselves. They'll sort of hear it in that dialect. And particularly for the Cajun dialect, and I'd spent so much time listening to people in that area and listening to those sounds. And when I was writing, even I did a lot of listening to like oral histories and recordings and that sort of thing. It was almost more about the rhythm of the speech than it was the particular pronunciation of the particular words. So to try to capture like one or two pronunciation things, that were so different, but then to find that rhythm of it is what really makes it ring true to me. Is rural people in particular, there's some similarities in those cadences and those rhythms, but there's some differences too. So if you can find that rhythm and you can find the one or two words that really make it special, make it unique to a particular place, then I think that really works pretty well.
I think about this a lot because my dad's family was all from rural East Tennessee. And so
yeah,
we have a lot of like Appalachian.
That's a beautiful dialect there too. Yeah, I love that.
And so like I grew up hearing it, like I can still hear my grandma Jean and like the way that she would say things, but when you get into school and you talk like that, you are often, at least I was, corrected. Ain't's not a word, that's a double negative, like you're missing a subject from this sentence. It's like, yeah, but you already know that I'm talking about me because I was the subject of the previous sentence. Like it's economical to leave it out of the second sentence because it's not necessary.
Right.
So because of the privileging of what I call a like white middle class mainstream English in schools, I think about that I think it's a really delicate dance of not wanting to overwhelm the reader because obviously that's not something that we want, by using white middle class mainstream English, but then also thinking about, but we also want to honor these linguistic differences and show that like these aren't bad ways of speaking, and they don't make you stupid. They don't make these characters stupid. And so I just think about like how I'm just curious always to hear how writers process that and what.
Sure, absolutely. My mother, I mentioned, was a teacher and a writer. She taught middle school English for 1,070 years, and I've had proper grammar drilled into me from the time I uttered my first word. So I know that. I know the truth, definitely, of what you're saying. But as a writer, I think, as someone who writes fiction, and particularly maybe as someone who comes into it from a theater background where character is everything, I will always, always, always choose character over, grammar. And I think for me, my family grew up, my mother's family particularly, was from the hills of eastern Oklahoma. None of them, my grandparents never went to high school, so it was a very rural, very by our modern standards, sort of uneducated background. And a lot of those, my distant like cousins and distant aunts and uncles, not my close family, but and I grew up knowing and hearing and feeling the respect, though, that my parents had for those people and for those stories, and for the way those stories are told as authentically as possible. So I think there's a balance. You need to be able to communicate as a writer. You need to be able to you got to know those grammar rules. You got to know what they are, so that your readers can understand what you're writing. But certainly, especially when you're writing character, the way we speak is such an identifiable way to know a character immediately. And the knowledge that rural people who speak in these dialects, or that have different word choices, or different like colloquialisms, or whatever it is, that those people have such a wealth of knowledge and such a wealth of experience that they bring into it, that just is, it's a different kind of knowledge. It's a different kind of everything.
I just think sort of the deficit, and we talked a little bit about this too, like, swamp people and sort of the representation of Cajun people as, as backwoods, backwater, like non-intellectuals, I guess. But I knew growing up that like that my grandparents, my great uncles, my great grandparent, like my great grandfathers, never graduated from high school, couldn't read or write really. And so like, when it was time for my dad to go to college, like my grandfather turned down college because he was working a farm. And then when it came time for my dad to go to college, like he wasn't encouraged to do it, but he also wasn't discouraged to do it. They were like,
Yeah.
sure, do whatever. But his SAT English scores were terrible. But that didn't mean he was stupid. He wasn't.
Yeah, no, yeah, sure. I think I grew up in a family, and this goes way back, even to those grandparents, back up in the hills of Oklahoma who never got a chance to go past 8th grade. I remember being, in college and hearing my grandmother, who was in her 80s, just be devastated about the fact that she never got to go to high school. So there was always, and they were always readers. My grandparents were both big readers. There was always this value of two things in our family that were always very important, and that was education and the power of story, or the value of story. So when you put those two things together, that's pretty good ingredients to grow a writer.
Yeah.
Or 10.
Yeah. And it's completely antithetical to the idea, like the prevailing sort of single story of rural people as, non-writers. I mean, like my great grandfathers couldn't read or write, but they would listen to my great grandmothers read to them and to the
Yeah.
They loved Westerns.
Yeah.
And they loved music, like the Grand Ole Opry.
Yeah, and I think that love of story is so interwoven, particularly in rural cultures. There's so much mythology, and there's so much lore, and there's so much, like, all of that rich history of story is there. It's just there, and it's in those people. And whether that comes out, in the oral storytelling tradition, or whether, they grow up and become writers, I think across the board, rural people are storytellers, almost all of them.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, that's how at least that was my experience. Like I learned about who I was around a campfire usually.
Yeah. Or the local bakery, down at the coffee shop with the guys that sit down there every morning. Like, it's all about story.
I was constantly at the farmer's table with my papa, and at 6 a.m. at the corner is what we called it. It was really called Cheryl's, whatever the diner was, or Faye's, and so, I think that's absolutely across the board a characteristic of rural cultures. So getting back to sort of like your own process, like I'm curious about, so you sort of talked about like you drove through the town of all of the psychics, and you had, been on that cruise where you came across Pilot Town, right?
Pilot Town,
Yeah. And so like, how do you collect ideas? How do you record your ideas? Like, how do you like what's your writing process like?
Well, it's very haphazard.
Okay.
I'll be honest with you. A lot of people ask me, like, that's one of my favorite questions, because people are always like, what is your writing routine? And I'm like, I do not have one. And honestly, I became a writer because I did not want a routine. Like I said, like, I was not kidding when I said, like, I was not meant to be the kind of person who gets up and like goes, at a certain time and does the same thing every day. I wanted that freedom and flexibility. So I take a lot of notes, like things come to me randomly, like in the car, or, I've got like scrap paper everywhere. I've got notes on my phone if I'm in the car, and it's always fun to try to go back and figure out what they say or what they mean. For me, though, place is very important. And every story that I have written so far starts with a setting, which I think is kind of unusual. That's not something, most people say, like, I get a plot idea, or I get a character idea. But mine always start with a place I want to set a story. I think this is a place that has a story to tell. What story does this place want to tell? Like, what story grows out of this setting or this particular location? So that's all of the things that I have written so far have started that way, from a seed of a place. And then it's a matter of finding the voice of the people that inhabit that place. And once you know those voices, once you know those characters, you just got to kind of wait around for them to tell you what they've been up to. And then you get a plot.
That's awesome. I think that is how I think about how people are formed, you know?
Yeah.
It all starts with the place. But place doesn't,
Absolutely.
you know, it's not something that a lot of people talk about. And it's not really that visible. So thank you for sharing that, because I think that is,
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah.
it's not a technique that I have heard a lot. But probably more so than other folks, especially because I talk to mostly rural writers who
Right.
in what places and what it means. So when you were talking about how to become a good writer, or how to, you know, that reading is really important for that. So what are the things that you like to read? What do you find is most helpful for you in terms of the stories that you like to tell?
Yeah, I told you that I recommended reading plays. I still love to read plays. I order new plays as often as I can to read. As someone who's worked as a director, particularly an actor, I love to read those. And the other nice thing that is nice about plays is they're cheap. They're super cheap. You can order like script copies for like $6 or $7 a piece. So you can load up on those. There are lots of places online you can order plays to read. So I love to do that. And of course, since I've been writing YA particularly, and I settled on writing YA because I worked for so long with high school theater students, and worked really closely with particularly the same bunch of theater students from the time they were in kindergarten to the time they graduated from high school. But particularly by the time they were in high school, we were doing some really complicated work together, and some really digging deep and doing some really deep stuff with those kids. And we got to know each other so well that I just felt like I knew their voices, and I knew sort of what made them tick. So that's why I gravitated toward YA when I started to write, was I felt like those were the voices that I knew. And particularly the voices of rural high school students, because this was Clarksville, Arkansas, where I was working in that theater company. And, those were the kids that I was hearing in my head all the time. So I read a lot of YA. I've always loved mysteries. I've always loved suspense and thrillers and horror. As a kid, I was particularly into like gothic stuff. Like Rebecca was my favorite book when I was young. So a lot of that sort of stuff. And particularly to the point that when I started to write, the first book that I sat down to work on was kind of a YA contemporary sort of issues kind of book, because that's the first idea that sort of popped into my head. And I got about halfway through that and I was like, why? This is not really what I want to read. Why is this what I'm writing? Why don't I just write what I want to read? Which was sort of mystery, suspense, thriller kind of stuff, particularly with those settings, and I think that's a kind of a throwback to those books I loved as a kid, Rebecca and books like that were very setting specific and very setting and atmosphere heavy.
That's really interesting about the plays. I think that playwrights are one of those, like, people just think that they're extinct, that they're no, it's kind of like poets. And I feel like that people think that about poets too. Like, people don't really teach living poets. I feel like we don't really teach living playwrights either, because
yeah, for sure. Yeah. And that's a shame, because there is great contemporary work being done, on both of those fronts, for sure.
Yeah. So I'm really glad that you said that. I hope that inspires some English teachers to.
Yeah, a great thing to do is just look up like 2020 best plays, or which plays were nominated for major awards at Drama Desk, and that sort of thing, and look at those plays, because there are some really spectacular scripts out of there. There, even from if you look up theater companies like the Steppenwolf in Chicago and other places like that sort of dedicate themselves to the production of new works. See what they're doing and get hold of those scripts, because there's great stuff out there.
Yeah, that is a really, really great advice, and I wish I would have had it while I was still in the classroom, because I totally would do that. Okay, let's see. Have you? This is sort of random, but
sorry.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say plays are great, yeah, for classroom use, because the other thing that's appealing about plays to kids is they're very short.
Short. Yeah.
You know, you pick up a play, it looks like this, you can read it in under 2 hours. So you can kind of sneak it in there to those people that might be like, this book is too big, and like, well, how about this little play? So it's a nice way to get around that too.
Yeah, they don't feel as intimidating. I don't think.
Absolutely not. You know, if you can perform it in less than 2 hours, you can read it in less than 2 hours. So
Right. I took a group of my high school students to see Noel Coward's Fallen Angels.
mm-hmm.
And they loved it. It was so good.
Yeah, no Coward's fun for sure. Yeah.
Like it was just the comedy. And we went to there's a place in Indianapolis called the Indiana Repertory Theater,
Mm-hmm.
RT. And they always have great casts. Like I've never been to a performance there that was bad, you know? And so these rural seniors went with me and really loved it. And so I think you're right. I think drama gets short shrift in the classroom. And
and I was thinking about, particularly in rural towns, particularly in small towns like we've talked about, like Chandler, where I grew up. I grew up with a great community theater in that tiny little town, which was a real gift. And one of the things that I think is wonderful about growing up in a setting like that in a small town is that if you are a creator, if you are an actor or a singer or a musician or a writer, that community is going to embrace you. You're gonna have opportunity. And if you want to go to New York and do theater, you want to go to LA and make movies or whatever, you've got to be like really good, right? But sometimes in those small towns, all you have to have is the passion for it, and if you've got that passion for it, you can bring it to your small town community theater. You can bring it to open mic night at your local coffee shop or whatever, and it gives you, I think, opportunities that ironically you don't always get in bigger towns, which is a really cool thing. Everybody can sort of get in on it.
Yeah. My dad's a professional musician, and he has like a music school sort of thing in his hometown, which is also a really tiny little town. And they do like stage performances where they do concerts where the students, get out and they perform what they're learning, and they do open mic nights at the local Moose Lodge,
Yeah. That's great. I mean, that's part of the beauty of that community is whatever talent you have, bring it. We want it, there's a lot to be said for that.
Yeah, I totally agree. So we're coming up on the end of our time together, and I thought maybe you might want to say a little bit about projects that you have been working on. I know that Secret So Deep, as you mentioned before, is coming out in September. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that and anything else?
Sure. Secret So Deep is actually set in the world of the theater. It's set at a seaside theater in Connecticut. This is another kind of a small town setting, and it's another one that I know really well. I spent 6 years working at a little theater on Long Island Sound in Connecticut that was dedicated to new playworks, called the Eugene O'Neill Theater Center, which is a really well-known sort of nursery for the American theater. That's where great plays and great musicals are born. So to be able to be there in that theater, right on the ocean, and smell the salt breezes and the fog, it was such a different thing for someone who grew up in, Oklahoma and Arkansas. And that setting was one that just really I grew to love and kept going back summer after summer after summer just to be there in that space with those people. So when I was looking for a seaside theater, that's kind of what I based it on. I wanted to set a story there, and it's about memory. It's about a girl whose mother drowned in an unexplained accident in that same location years ago, and she's kind of gone back as an actress there herself to try to untangle the mystery of her memories and what really happened. So it's another thriller. It's a very suspenseful sort of atmospheric mystery sort of thing. There's some really interesting local whaling lore and mythology and legends that kind of get woven into that, which makes it a lot of fun. So that comes out in September. And then I'm working on some new projects. I can't really say anything about them yet, but hopefully they'll be, hopefully it won't be too long before I'll get to talk about those, but also, some other really interesting sort of rural settings for sure.
Awesome. Well, I am excited for Secret So Deep. It sounds really fun. I love mysteries and thrillers. So to my students, every October we did like a spooky,
oh, that's cool. Yeah.
For sort of around Halloween and stuff like that. So I know that students love them too. And so I'm glad that there's somebody out there writing them and writing them as well as you do. So I will definitely have to get my hands on a copy of Secret So Deep, and I
Oh,
will
yay. Thank
sign
you.
up for other projects from you, because I'm really, really glad that I got the opportunity to read Dark and Shallow Lies and get a chance to talk to you and pick your brain a little bit about writing and place. So thank you so much for being here. I
Oh,
really
you're very welcome. Yeah, I had a great time. Thanks for having me.
Well, I hope you all enjoyed this week's episode. If you like what you heard and want to support the show and keep it a viable endeavor for me, it'd be great if you would like and comment on the YouTube episode. You could talk about what you liked most or what you walked away with. It'd also help if you'd subscribe to the channel. You can also head over to the Support Us page on the Literacy in Place website. There you can learn about all the different ways you can support this work. Like, you can like and follow the website itself, find out where to engage with us via social media, and go leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. Or you could shop our storefront on bookshop.org to get the book featured in this episode or any other books that catch your eye. You could also buy us a coffee at coffee.com and donate once or set up a recurring donation. All of this would be immensely helpful in keeping this show going. So thanks a bunch for doing what you can. Well, that's it for this episode. Until next time, y'all come back now, would ya?